Hello, everyone, and good morning. I am Michelle Lieberman, a partner in the commercial department of S. Horowitz & Co. And we are very excited to welcome you all to this webinar on doing business in the UAE. Who would have thought a few months ago that we would be holding such a webinar, and that the main reason that our friends from the UAE are not here in person and that this event is being held virtually is not the lack of diplomatic relations, but a worldwide pandemic. But indeed, these are strange and very challenging times. However, we're all starting to get used to this virtual world and its advantages. One of them being that we can be very nimble and have an event like this with very short prior notice and such a great attendance. So thank you all for joining us. And we at S. Horowitz & Co. are extremely happy for the opportunity to host this webinar. S. Horowitz & Co. is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. Yes, we have been around for longer than Israel has existed as a modern state. And throughout these years, we have always had a strong global presence and strong global connections, with some of our partners having been trained and having worked in South Africa, Australia, UK, US, and global projects taking us with our clients to all corners of the world, not only Europe, of course, the UK, the US, but also the Far East and Africa, all of this in a wide range of industries. It was therefore a natural fit that when the global organization Lex Mundi was established, a little bit more than 30 years ago now, we would be the Israeli member firm. I would ask for a show of hands, how many of you have heard of Lex Mundi, but I can't see you or your hands. For those who are not familiar with Lex Mundi is a worldwide network of independent law firms with over 150 member firms and over 22,000 lawyers. There's only one member firm in each jurisdiction, and each member firm undergoes a rigorous vetting process, both in order to become a member firm and to remain a member firm, as the member firms are evaluated every few years and membership is renewed or not. I currently have the honor of serving as the chair of Lex Mundi, and could actually talk to you about the organization and its advantages for an hour or more, but don't worry, I will not do that. However, I would be remiss if I did not take 2 minutes of your time to tell all of you who are interested in and doing global work about two extraordinary tools that Lex Mundi can offer you, and Lex Mundi firms can offer you. Because in addition to having top-notch law firms with top-notch lawyers who really truly know each other, and the close relationship that already exists between us and the UAE member firm here today, Afridi Angell, attests to that. Lex Mundi is constantly evolving and thinking in what ways it can service the member firms in order to service you, the clients. We know that our clients are constantly required to see around corners, to expect the unexpected, especially in these times. And that is why the Lex Mundi team has developed a global horizon scan tool that each member firm can offer to its clients. If you want to know if there are any expected changes in specific areas of law or specific industries, if you want to map where the high risks lie, you can receive a very coherent, concise, and truly readable report, tailor-made to the jurisdictions that interest you, flushing out exactly that. Oh, and I don't think I've mentioned, it's free. It is one of the benefits a Lex Mundi member firm has in advising its clients and being able to service their global needs. An additional tool that has been specifically developed by the Lex Mundi team for the Lex Mundi member firms and was launched just a few months ago is named Equisphere. Equisphere is a service delivery model through which no matter how many firms are involved, be it a few or many, the client can see which work is being done, by who, at what firm, where we are with respect to deadlines, where we are with respect to budgets, exactly the transparency that clients are looking for, making it that much easier to follow exactly what is happening in every jurisdiction. And if I may be very uncharacteristically optimistic and hope that the treaty with the UAE UAE, sorry, will lead to more global collaborations and more regional collaborations. This kind of tool is exactly what can make these kinds of collaborations seamless and so very easily manageable. But I promised I would not take up much of your time, and I always strive to keep my promises, so I will stop at that. But please feel free to contact me with any queries you may have. Now for some housekeeping items. This is, of course, a live webinar, so please feel free to post your questions in the question bar. You have it somewhere on the side, I think. Or if you are connected from your phone, I have been told, I have no idea, but I have been told, you have a question mark through which you can post your questions. We will answer all the questions at the end of the sessions. Before I turn the floor over to our dear friends from the UAE, I wish to extend our sincerest thanks to Nira Poran from ACC Israel for their collaboration in the webinar today. So, with no further ado, I am very happy to introduce Afridi Angell, which is the oldest full service law firm in the UAE, another thing we have in common. The firm was established in 1975 and celebrated its 45th anniversary this year. Afridi Angell is licensed in the three largest emirates of Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah, as well as the Dubai International Financial Center. And you will hear in a minute more about the structure of the legal system in the UAE, which is not a simple one. The firm is, of course, as I have already mentioned, the exclusive member in the UAE of Lex Mundi. Joining us today from Afridi Angell are partners Charles Labach, Bashir Ahmed, and Stuart Walker, who will walk us through the major highlights of the UAE structure and legal system, doing business in the UAE, and what investors need to know when they set up, invest, or do business in the UAE. So over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I agree with you that we both of our firms look forward to cooperating further with Horowitz going forward via Lex Mundi and in light of the new normalization of relations. I would like to talk to you about the overall legal system in the UAE. As Michelle indicated, it's a fairly complex legal system, and so it requires a little bit of, you have to step back. What I was saying is, after hello, the UAE is a new country, newer than Israel. Our 50th anniversary is next year. It began in 1971 when the British withdrew from their sphere of influence east of Suez. And 7 emirates, which were traditional desert Bedouin principalities, got together to form what is now a modern country. There is a federal government in the UAE, formed of the Supreme Council, the 7 rulers of the 7 emirates. But below the federal government, there is also, not below, but part of the federal government, there's also 7 emirate-level governments in each of the emirates. And one of the reasons that our firm has an office in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Sharjah is because each of these emirates has a different system, different legal system, different system of governance. And to know what's going on, you really got to be on the ground. Now, the UAE is part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, formerly known as the Cooperation Council of the Arab States of the Gulf, which does try to develop some free trade and so forth, cooperation among the member states, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman. The most important initiatives of the GCC for lawyers are that there is a possibility for some sectors for customs exempt transfer of goods between GCC countries, and also there is a common customs tariff, a 5% import duty for goods imported into the GCC from outside. What this means is that foreign investors, foreign businesses that set up in the UAE often have in mind not just the 9 million people in the UAE, but the, 20 million people or more than that in the GCC as a whole. So it's potentially a very large market that you can serve from from Dubai if you look at access into the GCC overall. Am I still good, Michelle? Sound?
Yes, indeed. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. I'll continue. The UAE, again, is a new country. There is an economist guide to the UAE that I've read in the past that says that most of the UAE's laws are based upon English laws. And that's a little bit misleading. The UAE really is more influenced by French law or by civil law than by common law. How does that happen? Before the UAE was formed, a number of the individual emirates enacted statutes that were based on Indian models. For example, Dubai, Sharjah, and Ras Al Khaimah each has a law of contract based upon the Indian law of contract from the 1890s, something like that. But there are very few examples of that are still on the books today. Most of the statutes that have been enacted in the UAE are based upon civil law models. You begin with the civil code, which is very close to the civil code of Jordan, which in turn is based on the civil code of Egypt, which in turn is based on the Napoleonic Code. And you've had similar statutes like that enacted in the years since the UAE became its own independent country that are again based upon civil law models. And it's not surprising because the Arabic-speaking countries as a whole are civil law countries, with the exception maybe of Sudan. So the UAE has borrowed from the other, mainly Egypt, but the other Arabic-speaking countries, Arab League member states. And at least until recently, most of the judges, most of the lawyers, most of the bureaucrats in the government departments here were not nationals of this country, but were nationals of other Arabic-speaking countries: Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, Sudan, Morocco. Now that's kind of changing. Now there's more and more. If you go to a government office or go to the court, you're going to see a local speaking Gulf dialect, wearing local attire and so forth. But that's a relatively recent development. The UAE has developed its legal system by way of statutes. You've got laws governing industries, labor law, banking. There's a commercial code, a civil code, a penal code, and many other sectors of activity are governed now by statutes. But at the same time, you have the emirate governments have retained quite a bit of sovereignty in the federal system. And what's really important for a business to keep in mind is the fact that at the emirate level, you have all of the rules that govern setting up a business, licensing and authorizing a business to conduct certain activities. Licensing rules are emirate. There's also an overlay of federal legislation, but the emirates kind of are in the driver's seat. Natural resources, mainly petroleum, hydrocarbons, that's also subject exclusively to emirate level control. No federal overlay there. If you want to explore for petrol in Abu Dhabi, it's the Supreme Petroleum Council in Abu Dhabi is the supreme regulator of that. Real property is also subject to emirate level laws. So again, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, they each have their own system of rules governing the sale, transfer, mortgaging of real property. And again, you've got to have a presence on the ground for us as a law firm to monitor developments there. So it's important to keep in mind that you've got the federation and then 7 different governments that run things on the ground. And at each level, you've got a judiciary, legislature, judiciary, at executive, three branches of government at the federal level and also at the level of each emirate. Some of the smaller emirates are not so rigidly divided into executive, legislative, and judicial, but certainly the federal government is, and the governments of Abu Dhabi and Dubai are. I'm going to talk very briefly about the legislative process. There is a very defined process for enacting legislation. You need to, at the federal level, you need to publish a statute or a decree in the Gazette. Let me just show you what it looks like. This is the Federal Official Gazette. And a law isn't a law until it appears in here. This is from April 2012. Many thumbed pages. We use this in our library. We're in there all the time. There's also a Federal Gazette for the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. This is what that looks like. And there's the Abu Dhabi flag, the pre-federation flag. And there's also an official gazette for the Emirate of Dubai. And there's one for Sharjah, one for Ras Al Khaimah, one for Al Quwain, one for Fujairah, one for Ajman. And all the official statutes and regulations and most of the orders and so forth are published in these gazettes. Interestingly, the UAE, as you probably know, has recently enacted a decree law repealing the Arab League boycott of Israel as observed in the UAE. That decree law hasn't appeared in the Gazette yet. It's too recent, but we expect to see it in one of these probably in, what, 4 or 5 weeks. There is a bit of a time lag between the announcement of the statute and its actual publication in the Gazette and the time the Gazette comes to us in the mail. In addition to these published materials, there's also, judgments of the courts. And so let me give you, there is a court system in Dubai. And again, the court reporter for Dubai looks like this. This is for the year 1995. It's an old one. But again, all the different judgments, the final judgments of the Dubai Court of Cassation and the final judgments of the appeal courts in Dubai appear in this volume, which we get again by mail every now and then. The federal judgments come out in this. This is a compendium of judgments of the Federal Supreme Court. All of these materials are in Arabic. So those of you who can speak Arabic or studied it in school, dust it off. You'll need it to work here. Although more and more of these materials appear in English as well, and they appear in English pretty quickly. Maybe a week or so within the date of publication, you get a translation of it. But here in the firm, we go back and check the Arabic too, because translations, number one, they're not official. Number two, they're not always that accurate. The legal profession here is split, like in some other countries. There are advocates who can appear in court, who have the right of audience to the court. The rule since 1991 has been that the practice of advocacy is restricted only to UAE nationals. So now it's more and more a national bar. There are some non-UAE nationals who were grandfathered in before 91 and can still practice, but they're a dwindling minority. People like me and my colleagues here, you'll see, are legal consultants. We can't appear in court, but we can render opinions on law, we can advise on law, we do everything else that a solicitor would do in another country that has a split system. And in fact, we are all regulated by the Department of Legal Affairs of the government of Dubai. So we have CLPD qualifications to comply with. We get licensed every year, renewed every year. And you can complain against us too with the Legal Affairs Department if you want. I don't think we have any complaints, but it's there. We've got a pretty good professional record. And I guess there's also a law school in the UAE. There's a faculty of law at the university in Al Ain, UAE University, and many of the colleagues that we deal with among the UAE national lawyers are graduates of that law school. And that's kind of a big picture of the legal system here. It's changing very rapidly. The UAE is a very rapidly developing country. You'll see the buildings and skyscrapers and all that, and you hear about those, but the legal system changes too. And it's the kind of thing where something is going on literally every couple of weeks. It's pretty major. Maybe the treaty with Israel is the most recent of those, but something like that, of that magnitude, happens fairly frequently here. And that all has an impact on how businesses can do business, set up here and conduct business in the UAE, whether using it as a base for the UAE or the GCC or the region as a whole. And I'd like to hand over now to my colleague, Bashir Ahmed, who is our firm's managing partner, who's going to talk to you about the various forms of doing business here in the UAE. So thank you for your attention, and now here's Bashir.
Thank you, Charles. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to be in touch with you. As Michelle has said, we have been meeting Michelle and her colleagues from S. Horowitz for a number of years at the Lex Mundi events, and we finally look forward to working together directly and to welcoming those of you who are interested in doing business in the UAE. Jumping straight into the subject, there are obviously a number of ways in which one can do business in a country. I guess it boils down to whether you need a presence on the ground or not. If a presence is not required, the simplest way is just to sell your products to buyers in the country, sell your products or your services. And with the abolition of the boycott law, We are now free to import goods and services from Israel. We're free to make payments, so financial transactions are permitted. So that's, I guess, the easiest and quickest way for Israeli companies to offer their products, services into the UAE. The next step up would be to sell without establishing a presence. And how would you do that? Well, you would appoint either a local distributor, a local agent, perhaps through a franchise type operation. And these are very common arrangements. Hundreds and hundreds of foreign companies operate this way. Purely contractual arrangements. Two words of caution on that. Number one, the UAE has something called a commercial agency law. And what this law says is that regardless of whether you're an agent, a distributor, or even a franchisee, you're termed, if you're representing a foreign principal in the supply of its goods or services, you could be termed a commercial agent. And if the commercial agent is registered, then this is something akin to a Catholic marriage. Divorce is extremely difficult. Even if the agreement is for a fixed duration, it's deemed to continue. And the principal cannot refuse to renew it. Grounds for termination are extremely limited. The law says that the agreement cannot be terminated or you cannot refuse renewal without valid reason. And then very helpfully, the law doesn't define what is valid reason. So this is something to look out for. Having said that, a large number of agencies do avoid such registration. It's perfectly possible to set up a distributorship, an agency arrangement without having a registered commercial agency. And that's where you would need local advice on how to structure that, how to make sure that you enter into an arrangement which is perhaps unregisterable under the law. And there are certain pros and cons to such arrangements. One of the requirements for an agent is that it must be 100% locally owned. Now, as you may be aware, the UAE has a huge expatriate population. The local population is perhaps 10 to 15%. We have about 200 nationalities, 201 if we now include Israel, and expats are at least 85% of the population. Similarly, in the business sphere, the expats are also have a large number of businesses, and a lot of these businesses also act as agents and distributors. And so whilst those can provide those services, they are not capable of registration under the law and therefore don't enjoy the protection. So there are a number of mechanisms to look at to make sure that you don't get tied up with the wrong agent permanently. One other issue is that if you are a foreign supplier of goods, you cannot have someone on the ground as an employee or a representative. So if you're not setting up your own presence, what happens is that typically you would ask your agent, you would second over some of your employees or representatives. And we see this quite common in tech-related pharmaceuticals, etc., where you would need specialized salespeople or people with technical knowledge actually to be on the ground and help your local agent or distributor to distribute your products. And in such cases, you would typically second a number of employees to the local agent, and they would work as part of your team. So those are the ways of really operating without a presence. Now, if you decide the business warrants it, then the next step up is obviously to set up a local presence here. Now, as Charles has mentioned, there are 7 emirates. Each emirate has its own licensing regulatory regime. In addition to the 7 emirates, there are probably 30 or 40, at least, free zones. Each free zone has its own licensing business regulatory regime. So when we talk of the UAE, we're not talking of one jurisdiction, but dozens and dozens. At the federal level, there is a federal companies law which applies across the board, except to free zones. And the companies law sets out a number of structures, types of companies. Most of these are of no use or of no interest to a foreign investor. But just to run through them, for example, the company's law also covers partnerships, general partnerships, and limited partnerships. Again, these are not really suitable for foreigners because the general partner must be a UAE national. The company's law also provides for a public joint stock company or a public shareholding company. This is a company that can issue its shares to the public and can list on a stock exchange, again, of limited interest to a foreign investor coming into the market afresh. The company's law then also has something called a private joint stock company or a private shareholding company, which is pretty much identical to the public company with the distinction that it cannot sell its shares to the public. These are, again, of limited use, although they have been used as joint ventures in certain infrastructure projects by foreign companies with government entities at a very high level. The number of such ventures is very small, although the dollar component of each one of these would obviously be fairly large. So by far the most common structure is the limited liability company, the LLC. And I would expect perhaps 95% of the companies that are formed, if not more, in the UAE are LLCs. The LLC is by far the most flexible structure for a foreign investor. Whilst all companies must be at least 51% owned by UAE nationals, the LLC allows a disproportionate distribution of dividends. It allows management control to be exclusively in the hands of one of the partners, which can be the foreign party, or even a third party who's a non-partner. It's also common to structure such arrangements so that the foreign shareholder, in effect, receives the entire dividend and exercises complete control. The local shareholders' interest in such cases would be restricted to a fee, and we typically recommend that such fee should be a lump sum fee and not a percentage of the profits or of the revenue, so that the local partner then has no interest in the books of the company, doesn't care how it's doing, he just receives this flat fee for acting as the nominal 51% shareholder. And these arrangements are prevalent. Now, one other way of setting up is, as I said, the numerous free zones. The free zones have a great number of advantages. First of all, there is no local participation requirement. So businesses, any business in a free zone can be 100% foreign owned. The free zones also generally, I would say virtually all of them, guarantee a 50-year tax holiday on income tax. By the way, onshore, there is at present no corporate or personal income tax, with the exception of foreign banks who pay 20% tax on their profits. So we're not used to filing tax returns, but that one day will change. As you know, the two things that are certain in life are death and taxes, so that they are on their way here. But the free zones do guarantee income tax holidays. The free zones allow you to set up business in a number of ways. One is to set up directly a branch of a foreign company. The other way is to set up a subsidiary, which is typically referred to as a free zone establishment or a free zone company, which can be 100% foreign owned. From a practical perspective, it doesn't matter whether you have a branch or a subsidiary. Sometimes it's a question of just tax structuring from your home country or corporate structuring governance, which determines the decision as to how to go about this. Why would you set up onshore if you have these wonderful advantages in a free zone? Well, essentially, the free zone companies are only intended to do business in the free zone. So if you are a General Motors or a Sony or Samsung, you would establish a distribution center, a regional headquarters in one of the free zones where your goods can move in and out freely. You can supply your agents and distributors across the region, rest of Asia, Africa, Middle East, etc. But when those goods move into the UAE, you would still need to deal with a local agent. So sometimes it is necessary to have a local presence as well as a free zone presence. And we have seen a number of companies, for example, still choosing to set up in a free zone because they like the control, the 100% control that they can get, the guarantees of tax holidays, the ability to invoice within the group. But sometimes those companies, if they need to service customers on the ground, do establish a local presence. Now, as I said, there are numerous free zones. They generally form, I would say, three categories, three types of free zones. There are the free zones which are customs zones, and the largest of these is the Jebel Ali Free Zone in Dubai, which is the largest and oldest free zone in Dubai. It has perhaps over, I believe, 7,500 companies operating there. And as a customs free zone, it has a barrier, physical barrier around it. Goods move in and out, and when they enter the UAE, you have to go through a customs zone, pay the customs duty on the goods. There are a number of other free zones which don't have such barriers. There's one called the Dubai Multi-Commodities Center, the DMCC. There is the Internet City. So these are for companies that don't deal in physical goods. So if you're a commodity trader, trading on paper, if you're in tech, and you're not moving physical goods around, then you could set up in one of these free zones. There are no barriers around these free zones. It's just, it would be a couple of blocks in the city, which is designated as a free zone with its own regime. The third category of free zones, which I will defer to my colleague Stuart, is what is known as a financial free zone. And these are something totally different, and the UAE laws generally don't apply. And for those, I will hand over to Stuart now, and he'll give you a talk on those.
Good morning. My name is Stuart Walker. Thank you for the introduction, Bashir. I'm just going to take a few more minutes of your time to talk specifically about the financial free zones in the United Arab Emirates. We have two financial free zones. They are the Dubai International Financial Centre, commonly known as the DIFC. And down the road in Abu Dhabi, we have the Abu Dhabi Global Markets, known as the ADGM. So as Bashir explained, we have these free zones throughout the United Arab Emirates for industry-specific activities. The financial free zones were set up specifically to attract financial institutions into the UAE in recognition that the onshore regulatory regime was as not as appealing or as attractive perhaps to international financial services organizations as it could be. So the DIFT was created in 2004 and the ADGM came along a little bit later in 2015. They are discrete geographical areas. Each is approximately 100 hectares in size, and they sit about 150 kilometers apart. So ADGM down in Abu Dhabi and the DIFC in Dubai. Now, why would you want to consider setting up in one of these financial free zones? If you are any type of financial services business, or if you are a supplier to financial services businesses and want to be close to them, so lawyers, accountants, other consultants, you will want to be in one of these two financial free zones. They are designed, customized, built specifically to be attractive to international financial organizations that want to operate in this region. So entities in those jurisdictions are licensed to operate in and from the financial free zone. So a financial services provider in the DIFC can deal with entities customers and clients in the DIFC, but also outside the DIFC, residents of the United Arab Emirates or beyond can be customers of financial free zone companies. So with the last couple of minutes, I just want to explain why these areas are attractive. And the reason is, as Bashir mentioned earlier, that the general laws and regulations of the UAE are disapplied within the financial free zones. They have their own bespoke legislation. They have their own dedicated regulators, and significantly, they have their own dedicated courts, which, although they're part of the UAE court system, operate quite differently. The judges are common law judges, proceedings are in English, and the predictability of the courts and the decisions rendered by those is perhaps higher than might be expected with some of the onshore courts, given that they are specialized courts dealing with financial services disputes. So that's really all I want to say at this stage about the financial free zones. They are definitely venues worth considering if you are a financial services provider or a supplier to financial services businesses. They are fit for purpose and very sensible places to house your business if you want to provide financial services in this region. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that now, yes, Charles and Bashir and Stuart will be there in a panel in a second to answer your questions. Just a shout out to Asaf Griel. I think you raised your hand, but I don't see a question. So I don't know if you pressed it by mistake or you meant to ask a question, but if you have a question, please post it in the question bar. So I'll just wait for a second for our, hello. Okay. Hello. The first question, and I apologize if I get the name wrong sometimes when it's in English and it's a Hebrew name, from Dima Rainer. Could you please clarify on the block of counties that you referred to? I think it was you, Charles, for custom exceptions.
Sure. Yeah, I did talk about that. It's the Arab Gulf Cooperation Council, and they are Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and Oman. 6 of them. Qatar right now is kind of like in its own category, as you might have read in the press. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and UAE and Egypt are engaging in a kind of a trade boycott against Qatar right now. But those are the 6 countries that, number 1, have a common customs law. So the 5% customs duty that applies in the UAE, in fact, applies to any goods coming into those 6 countries. And the theory is that once goods come into the GCC, they can move internally without further customs duties being imposed when they move from country to country. And the second benefit of the GCC is that there is provision for goods manufactured within the GCC to be eligible for what is called a GCC Certificate of Origin, and that certificate gives them customs-free entrance into the other member states. These are not goods imported to the GCC, but goods manufactured in the GCC. The rules are, 1, they've got to be manufactured in a facility that is at least 51% owned by nationals of the GCC. Number 2, the value added within the GCC must be at least 40%. And if those 2 criteria are met, ownership and value add, then the exports of that industrial facility would be eligible for a GCC Certificate of Origin, which then would be honored in the other GCC member states and give those products customs-free entrance into those countries. There are a couple of, it doesn't work too well in the hydrocarbon sector, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. They impose duties anyway. They don't want the UAE to take over the whole Gulf with the lubricants and things like that. But for other products, it generally does hold true that you get customs-free entrance into the other GCC countries. It's an example of how you can use the UAE to access a much wider market. Clear?
To me, yes. If we get an additional question, I will let you know on that. The next
Sure.
question is from Khagit Mazouz. She asked, are there any legal restrictions on limitation of liability clauses, such as bodily damages or the like?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Limitation of liability is permitted in respect of breaches of contract. And if you put a clause in a contract saying that the first party's liability for breach of contract shall be subject to a monetary limit, or you can just disavow liability completely. And in principle, those clauses are normally enforced. They are not enforced in a number of specific areas. One is what I think the questioner mentioned, tort liability, wrongful acts. It's black letter law in the Civil Code of the UAE that you cannot prospectively disavow or limit liability for a tort. You can settle, of course, once the tort's committed, but you can't do it prospectively. Likewise, for violations of a statutory duty, likewise for a criminal act, and likewise there's a judge-made rule that a limitation of liability is not enforceable for an act that constitutes willful or reckless misconduct, which sounds like a tort a little bit, but they don't talk about it in that sense. So that's the answer is yes, they're generally enforceable, but there are a couple of 5 fairly important exceptions. Okay?
Thank you. The next question also from Khagit Mazouz. Can the government claim immunity in order to avoid commercial obligations?
You take that too? Yeah. All right. Yeah, all right. That's also one of these questions that has 2 answers. Okay. Number 1, actually more than 2 answers. The government of Dubai has a local, Dubai level law that requires, that basically insulates the government from claims against creditors unless the government waives it. And it's the government and the ruler of Dubai. It's not like everything else, but it's the government and the ruler. And what normally happens is that the government agrees to resolve disputes on contracts by arbitration. But if you don't have that, the government is formally, it benefits from this procedure. A claimant against the government of Dubai has to first address the claim to the ruler's office for resolution. And if the ruler's office does not admit the claim, then it goes to arbitration. That's the normal process. But taking it outside of Dubai, the federal government, the government of Abu Dhabi, things like the armed forces, things like the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, they don't have limitation, they don't have immunity. You can sue them. If you go look at the docket in Abu Dhabi, probably half of it is claims against the government. I mean, everyone sues the government because there are projects, they fall behind, things happen. And the courts are actually pretty good about hearing claims against the government. They're not biased in favor of the sovereign party like you might think they would be. They look at the case and its merits and aren't really systemically biased against the sovereign. What does happen, though, is that there is a statutory provision in the Code of Civil Procedure that exempts government property and government assets from attachment. So if you get a judgment from the courts, whether they're local courts or foreign courts, you cannot attach assets of the UAE government, public assets, in execution of that judgment, nor can you attach them as a preliminary remedy, a provisional remedy when you file suit. So in some countries, that's a recipe for disaster, but the UAE government pretty much follows the law. And so if you get a judgment, there are a couple of exceptions, but really very few. Yeah, they pretty much honor it. Federal, Abu Dhabi, all the Dubai, the other Emirates. So it's a government that follows its own rules. Maybe one of a few in this part of the world, but it does. So even though you can't attach assets, you'll get your claim.
Could I just, I would just like to add a word in defense of Dubai. I think Charles is giving it a bad rap. Dubai is the only emirate which has put out legislation setting out the procedure for filing a suit against the government or government agencies. And they're very proud of this law because they say, look, we actually have a procedure set out. And whilst the first step is that you write to the ruler's office and you ask for permission, that is really an opportunity for the ruler's office to contact the relevant agency, and we have done this on time, and say, hey, there is a claim against you, what's going on? You've got 60 days to sort this out, or we will give the claimant permission to go ahead and sue. And that's what happens every day. So, you know, it's not a break, it's actually a mechanism for speeding up and trying to avoid litigation. Beyond that, once you have a judgment or an arbitral award, Dubai again has the same restriction that you cannot seize government assets, but those awards and judgments are honored routinely. And we have obtained several against the government in the past, and they have been honored.
Yeah, I guess it's our experience that in Dubai, you're better off going to the ruler's office with your case and having them sorted out than going straight to arbitration, because, you know, it can obviously be taken the wrong way if you go straight to disputes. And I guess the other thing is that all these issues, limitation of liability, sovereign immunity, the standard rule on the DIFC and AGM is different, right? Because you have different rules on that. So it's a little bit a different governing, not entirely when you talk about the financial free zones.
Yeah, and the other thing that Dubai has done historically has been to set up special tribunals to deal with particular issues. So approximately 10 years ago, the tail end of the financial crisis, there was an issue with Dubai World, a major government entity, and carrying quite a lot of debt. So a special Dubai World Tribunal was established as a subset of the DIFC courts to handle those claims specifically, which worked quite well, actually.
Thank you. I was going to say, Charles, you were in the hot seat, but you managed to spread it around to your partners. Next question is from Oren Stern. And you mentioned arbitration, of course, with respect to the previous question, but his question was, is arbitration a popular method for commercial dispute resolution in the UAE? And I think we can take that together with the question by Eli Schulman. He asked if you can please address options for dispute resolution involving foreign parties, such as international arbitration.
So you go ahead.
So arbitration is an increasingly common form of dispute resolution. The UAE adopted the New York Convention, I believe, 2006. Prior to that, I was certainly never enthusiastic about having an arbitration clause because it simply meant that you ended up litigating twice. But since 2006, foreign arbitral awards are being enforced routinely. Local arbitration awards are also now recognized and being enforced. So arbitration is a perfectly acceptable method of dispute resolution. We have a chapter of the LCIA here in Dubai. We have a couple of arbitration centers, and so I'm very comfortable recommending arbitration.
You can also opt into the DIFC courts, right?
Yeah.
Parties are free to elect the jurisdiction of the DIFC court and use that English language common law style process if they wish to. They don't actually have to have any connection with the DIFC other than to elect for that jurisdiction.
We commonly in our commercial contracts with between foreign counterparts and local counterparts will provide for DIFC court jurisdiction, even though there's no connection with the DIFC. And this gives you a court system, as Stuart says, which is modeled on the English system. We have barristers arguing cases in English with English High Court judges, foreign High Court judges sitting on the panel.
Thank you. And just and if you choose arbitration, is it local law? You can choose any kind of law to apply and any regulations to apply?
you can choose any governing law you like, and you can choose the center of arbitration. So you could have, for example, LCIA arbitration, ICC arbitration, as well as there is a decent center in Dubai as well, which is the Dubai International Arbitration Center. Ad hoc arbitration is also permitted.
Thank you. A question from Alisa Buchman. The question is, what kind of regulation do you have for medical devices?
There is recently a law which has come out, I'm talking about the last few weeks, dealing with registration of medical devices and so on. The law has not been fully promulgated, and that we're waiting for the implementing regulations. So yes, there is a law. We don't know what it says yet, and our clients in the medical industry are waiting for our update on that.
Yeah, healthcare, there are a couple of industry sectors where there tends to be a lot of variation between the Emirates, and healthcare is one of them. And in fact, there's a very different regulator in Abu Dhabi from Dubai, different regulators. So very often a drug or a device or something, or even a physician who's qualified in one emirate is not necessarily qualified in the other. So it's one of these things where the federal nature of the UAE comes into play in a very real sense.
Thank you. The next question from Gail Golden. Is there a specific provision in contract law with respect to distribution agreements?
Yeah, I mean,
let me take that.
Go ahead, yeah.
So we don't have a contract law. There is a commercial code which deals with distribution arrangements, agency arrangements. But the commercial code is subject to specific laws. That's a general code. And the specific law is the one I referred to earlier, which is the commercial agency law, which requires that the agent must be a UAE national and must be registered. The agreement must be exclusive. And once he's registered, he cannot be terminated, and you cannot refuse to renew such an agreement. And that's why I was saying that there are ways around that registration, and we would never recommend that you enter into a registrable contract unless there's absolutely no choice.
Thank you. Next question from my partner, Amit Steinman. The question is about government subsidies and grants for foreign investments in any specific industries and any specific sectors. We have those kinds of things, obviously, in Israel. We don't know if you have something similar in your regions.
No, one of the consequences of there being no taxation here is that there are no government grants or subsidies or handouts to foreigners. So, foreigners are expected to come and put the cost of their business, and the government tries to make it attractive by not having taxation. There is something which I forgot to mention. There's an FDI law that was promulgated a couple of years ago, which allows foreign investment onshore with majority owned or even 100% ownership in certain sectors. There is a positive list of, I think, 100 items or so, which are eligible for this special exemption from local ownership requirements. And there is also a negative list of a dozen or so items where foreigners are not allowed to invest.
Can I make one additional point? I mean, Bashir is absolutely correct in saying that there are no sort of subsidies. The closest we get, I suppose, is that commercial license fees, which can be substantial, have been waived for some businesses or reduced. I'm thinking particularly in the financial free zones, fintech businesses. There's an effort to encourage the development of innovative fintech businesses and to bring people into those financial free zones. So we're seeing at the moment that there are reduced regulatory fees and reduced licensing fees for startups of that sort, but no subsidies as such.
Thank you. The next question from Odeda Gam, who wanted to know about any regulations or restrictions that are with respect to individuals or corporations or partnerships that would like to invest in Israeli entities, whether it's startups, VCs, or any other kind of investment here.
Jeremy.
Okay, well, previously, as Charles mentioned, there was a boycott of Israel law that has been repealed. So there are no restrictions whatsoever on dealing with Israel, Israeli persons, Israeli goods, or financial transactions with Israel. So we're free to go.
Great, that was our hope. Next question from Miki Salne. If you can elaborate about the PPP market and the opportunities for Israeli companies, specifically in providing professional services and advice in the PPP market.
Sure, go ahead. Okay, all right.
So the PPP market, we think, is going to be one of the areas which will be attractive to Israeli companies. The reason for that is, I think the government is obviously looking at a lot of PPP arrangements, public-private arrangements, and the government, I suspect, is way ahead of the private sector in looking to do business with Israel. We expect a lot of interest in certain sectors. Power, desalination, tech, agro, etc. And I think the government would be interested in that and would be at the forefront. We expect the government to be leading the charge to do business with Israel, and PPP is one of the mechanisms.
Great. Okay, now there are a few IP questions, so bear with me while I collect them all. Professor Amir Khoury asked if you could describe the intellectual property scene with respect to PCT registration, trademark registration, etc., for incoming products and know-how. I might be trying your patience with putting all these together. Another IP question was if the government can permit infringement of third parties' intellectual property rights for the benefit of government in accordance with the English law, and that is a question by Hagit Mazuz. And I think that's a similar question. The next one is with respect to medical devices, so I will leave that for a second. So did I put too much together, or are we okay?
No, I think I'll talk about IP. If I missed something, let me know. Bashir and I came over here in the 80s, and when we arrived, the IP was the Wild West. There was no IP protection at all. There were copied products. There were pirate videos. It was just crazy. And that all changed. It changed quite abruptly in the early 90s when the UAE enacted a copyright law and a patent law and a trademark law. And the system has gone pretty well as far as trademarks and copyrights are concerned. Copyright was interesting because they were able to get all the people from the Ministry of Information, whose main job at the time was censorship, and put them on copyrights. And so copyright, it took off. And trademarks, just register them with the Ministry of Economy, and it's valid for 10 years and it's renewable. So at least on the books, there is trademark and copyright protection. What you don't get is some kind of a supranational protection. That is, you can't go and file in Morocco and get protection for the whole Arab League. You can't file in Riyadh and get protection for the whole GCC. You've got to go country by country. So in the UAE, you file a patent, trademark, or copyright, you get protection in this country only. The patent registration system is kind of clunky. The examination of patents is outsourced, to the Patent Office of Austria. And it's our experience that patent applications are very, very slow. We actually had one that took 21 years to get approved. Yes. Yes, I'm serious. So again, keep in mind this is a developing country, and everything. These kind of things are often, matters of first impression, and they don't always go as quickly as you'd like. Often there's pressure from the UAE's trading partners, like America, to put a law on the books quick, and they do it, but then implementation might lag a bit. And this is not only true of IP. So you've got nice laws in the statute books. You've got the facility to register different kinds of IP rights. Enforcement can be, again, a bit uneven. If it's a direct copy or direct passing off, the courts might take action. There's also administrative action that you can take. But very often, as you know, people don't copy trademarks and copyrights directly, but they kind of do it, 50% or 75%. And their action can be a little bit more complicated. There are remedies available. It often takes some thinking and some brainstorming, but you're best off putting as many contractual protections in as you can, and probably not disclosing your IP to local counterparties if you don't need to. To answer your question about, I think it was compulsory licensing. Again, the right is there in the statutes, but it's never exercised. So you're not going to have a government agency just declaring suddenly that your patent belongs to the government and they'll pay you for it. This happens in some countries, but not here. Anything to add to that?
No, could I just add, I haven't come across a single instance of the government taking over anyone's IP rights. The problems that Charles has mentioned with enforcement is really a reflection on the quality of the local judiciary. They're not so sophisticated. And the problem is at that level, there's no preference given to, the local party over the foreign party or anything of that sort. It's a competence issue. It's not a preference point.
So one follow-up question to that is about PCT, especially for know-how.
Yeah.
Nothing specific to add to that?
No, not really. It's the same picture, yeah.
And another follow-up question was, when is the new legislation on medical devices expected to be? If it's anything like Israel, it's like your guess is mine, but
yeah, well, the law says that the regulations will be promulgated sometime in the next year, and then companies will have a certain period to comply with that. I'd be happy, if someone sends out an email, to send you a little note on that. We're preparing a short note for our clients in the industry, and I'd be happy to forward that.
You see this fairly often, Michelle, in some areas of regulation. The government will promulgate a statute, but it will leave the details to a regulation, and the regulation comes out from either the cabinet or one of the ministries. And there might be a considerable time lag between the statute taking effect and the regulation giving guidance to the market as to how you can comply with the statute. And again, this is the kind of thing we deal with all the time.
As it's not, so.
Over and over and over again. So that's, but again, what the statute always appears in the Federal Gazette or the Emirate level Gazette, but then often the regs come out months later, well after the time they're supposed to be promulgated. So it's just part of the landscape here.
To give you an example, we have recently the UAE has repealed the law on registration of security interests over movable assets.
Yes.
So there was a law providing for registration of interests, and there was a registry set up. Now, the law has been repealed, a new law has been promulgated with no regulations as yet. So we're in a limbo, and it could be months or even a year before we know what happens. And there's no mention as to what happens to existing registered security interests. It's just there's a gap, and we've got to sit and wait and see.
Thank you. There's quite a few questions. We'll have to see how we deal with all of them. Maybe we can keep you on a little bit more. But Nira Puran wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit about limitations and rules in the real estate field.
Oh dear, real estate. Limitations. Do you mean limitation of liability, or just like the kinds of rules?
No, real estate.
Yeah, okay, good.
So, as Charles mentioned, real estate is governed by each of the Emirates. The rule is that foreigners can only buy real estate, for example, in Dubai, in certain designated zones. And those zones have now pretty much taken over most of the city, but they are still designated zones. Foreigners can buy in what are called freehold areas, and outside of that, they can only have a leasehold interest. So that's how the real estate market works. In Abu Dhabi, foreigners could only have leasehold interest, but I believe that was changed or is being changed.
No, I think I'll check. See, I don't think so, but there was a limitation in Abu Dhabi that a non-national of the UAE could purchase real estate interests. They give it Islamic law names, Murabaha and Musharaka, if I recall correctly, or Manfa. Yeah, Murabaha and Manfa. But up to 99 years. These are like they're akin to leaseholds. Yeah. And the maximum there is 99 years. And again, if you go to Sharjah, it's different again. So every place has different rules on real estate, different rules on whether foreigners can acquire real estate interests or not, and where. When you're talking about infrastructure projects, most of those are leased, 30-year leases, things like that. So a project goes in to a 30-year plot of leased property. You build a power plant, you generate power and water, and that's your leasehold. Again, and there are real estate registers in all the Emirates to your emirate level. So in Dubai, there's a real estate registration department. There's a land department in Abu Dhabi, a land department in Sharjah. And again, to prove that someone owns land, you get a certificate from the land department. To prove you have the right to lease land, it should likewise be a clean certificate. Sometimes people own land and do not have the right to lease it or to sell it without the government's permission. So you've got to look at things like that. And again, it's different. The UAE is all over the place. 7 different sets of real estate rules, basically. Anything to add there? DIFC, you can pretty much, is all you can buy, you purchase, right? Index powers in DIFC, right? Yeah.
Right. One of the issues that sometimes comes up with real estate and ownership is we're now at the point where foreigners have been able to buy own real estate for long enough that inheritance issues are now becoming relevant, which was not initially contemplated by the legislation. So there's still some work and some disputes on inheritance matters involving real estate assets.
No one was supposed to pass away in the UAE. That's a good formula for eternal life. An additional question from Noam Waldox. Are there classes of UAE investors that venture capital or private equity funds can market to without registration in the UAE?
I think there's scope in DIFC, isn't there? More than onshore.
Yeah, onshore it's regulated as scope.
It's very, very difficult.
Yeah, the financial services and the offering of securities and investment products is an area of increasing regulation, both onshore and in the financial free zones. We are rapidly moving away from the sort of Wild West approach of a few years ago, where there was really no regulation for some of these things. There is a lot more these days.
And more enforcement too. I mean, the days of suitcasing are basically, while you can do some limited offerings, visits to clients in DIFC, can't you? For short-term, one-off kind of things, right? But
well,
am I wrong about
yes and no.
Okay.
There are prohibitions of financial promotions that need to be paid attention to.
I would just like to add on, Stuart used the term the Wild West. There has been for years the perception that the UAE and Dubai in particular has been, similar to the BVI or Mauritius or one of these offshore jurisdictions where you can pretty much do as you please and open bank accounts freely. That has really changed over the last few years. We've seen increasing regulation. This is not your typical offshore jurisdiction. Banks have increasingly stringent KYC requirements. Setting up companies here involves satisfying economic substance requirements. Some of these have been really dictated by the US government or by the EU to stop this place being considered a tax haven for people from Europe or the US. So it is becoming increasingly regulated.
Another question from Hilal Gross, and I realize that we're close to the end of our time, but I'll try to squeeze in 2 more questions. If UAE investors are limited or restricted if they want to invest in Israeli technology? On your end, not on our end.
No restrictions whatsoever. Yeah.
Short and simple. There was a general question, which I think by Asaf Wise, what would be the best way to learn about doing business in the UAE? If there's a website of the Ministry of Economy in Israel, are there any equivalent website in the UAE or anywhere that one can look into and get the preliminary information?
The best way is to contact you, Michelle, and arrange one of these sessions. The reason is, as we've mentioned, there are so many different jurisdictions and regimes. There isn't a single source that you could go to. So you do need to shop around.
So that is a good question for the last one. No, but just I think first off, I know Dink Samver, you had a few specific questions that you're representing an Israeli company in MEE and so forth. I think if you could contact us afterwards with those specific questions, we will be happy to answer them. I have a question by Phil Waldock. Is Sharia law applicable in any area?
Sharia.
Well, Sharia is applicable in inheritance matters and personal laws, not in commercial transactions. There are specialist Sharia courts. And Sharia law doesn't apply to non-Muslims. So as I mentioned, we have an 85% expat population. Perhaps the biggest number of these would be Indian, the biggest single population from the subcontinent. A large number of them are Hindus. And, the UAE courts in such matters will say, well, bring us a copy of the law that's applicable to you, and we will apply foreign law in personal matters, in inheritance issues, and so on. So the courts are quite liberal that way.
Yeah. But basically, Islamic law, Sharia law would apply to personal status matters for Muslims. And then that's it. It doesn't, even things like interest-bearing transactions are generally enforceable. Things like derivative transactions are generally enforceable now. So the stuff that you get in some countries, maybe you don't get here. UAE is very commercially minded.
I think we'll just end with one follow-up question by Jon Meyer with respect to the new legislation regarding medical devices, which has proved to be very, very interesting. And there was one question if it applies also to drugs or if this is a different legislation.
Will this apply to drugs, or is it just devices?
I'll have to check that. I can send out a note to you, Michelle, after this, and we can pass that on.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. And again, there were some specific questions. We can pick them up and send them to you. I realize we're 2 minutes over time, so I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you. Charles and Bashir and Stuart from Afridi Angell for taking the time, and it's been a great pleasure as was expected, and I hope to have many opportunities now, as we said when we chatted before. And if any of you have any questions, please feel free to contact any of us. We will be sending over all of our contact details following this webinar to all of you, so feel free to use them. And there's 2 follow-up questions that we will send to you as well. Thank you so much, all, and have a great day.
Pleasure. Yeah, Michelle, thank you, and thanks to our friends at ACC. It's been a pleasure dealing with you, and we hope to see you in person.
Definitely. Good day.
Good day.